Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of El Paso, Texas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the barren landscape of West Texas, where the Rio Grande cuts through the desert like a silver blade, the town of El Paso was little more than a dusty outpost in 1884. The railroad had arrived just 3 years prior, transforming what was once a small settlement into a growing frontier town. El Paso stood at a crossroads, not just geographically where Texas met New Mexico territory and the Mexican border, but between lawlessness and civilization. What happened in that sun-baked corner of Texas during the tenure of Sheriff Nathaniel Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing chapters in the history of the American frontier, a chapter that many have tried to erase. In March of 1884, a young journalist named Thomas Mercer arrived in El Paso, seeking to document the rapid transformation of the American Southwest. What he found instead was a town gripped by a peculiar silence. The residents of El Paso went about their business with downcast eyes, speaking in hushed tones when discussing local affairs. The jail, a 2-story adobe structure that stood at the edge of town, cast a long shadow despite its modest size. It was there that Mercer first heard the whispers about Sheriff Blackwood and his pack of dogs. According to courthouse records discovered in 1962 during a renovation of the El Paso County offices, Nathaniel Blackwood was appointed sheriff in September of 1883 following the unexplained disappearance of his predecessor. These records, yellowed with age and water-damaged in places, revealed that Blackwood had previously served as a deputy in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. What the official records failed to mention was that Blackwood had been dismissed from his position there under circumstances that were never made public. El Paso in 1883 was a town in transition. The Southern Pacific Railroad had connected it to both coasts, bringing an influx of travelers, merchants, and opportunists. The population had swelled from barely 700 in 1880 to over 1,500 by the time of Blackwood's appointment. The once quiet border settlement was now home to 21 saloons, numerous gambling establishments, and a red light district that operated in plain view. Law enforcement was a challenging proposition at best, and the town council had been through 3 sheriffs in the previous year alone. Blackwood's arrival coincided with a pledge from Mayor Jeremiah Wilson to restore order to our growing community. According to the El Paso Herald's September 14, 1883 edition, the new sheriff was introduced to the public as a man of experience and firm resolve, who will not shy from the difficult task of taming our more lawless elements. The newspaper described Blackwood as imposing in stature, with a demeanor that suggests he will brook no nonsense from those who disturb the peace. What the newspaper failed to mention was the pack of dogs that arrived with Blackwood. According to the recollections of Samuel Porter, a stable hand who later gave testimony to Professor Hartfield in 1957, the new sheriff came to town with 5 large canines that weren't like any dogs I'd ever seen before. Bigger than normal, with something in their eyes that wasn't right. They didn't bark much, just watched, always watching. Porter's account states that within weeks of his arrival, Blackwood had constructed special kennels behind the jail. He wouldn't let anyone near those dogs except himself, and eventually that deputy of his, Hayes, built the kennels himself, working through the night. You could hear him talking to those animals like they understood every word. What drew Mercer's attention first were not the prisoners who vanished from the jail, but rather the unusual number of drifters and travelers who seemed to pass through El Paso, only to disappear without trace. The El Paso Herald, in its sparse coverage from October 1883 to April 1884, made no mention of these disappearances. Yet, in Thomas Mercer's personal journal recovered from a trunk in his niece's attic in Burlington, Vermont, in 1953, he noted with growing concern the frequency with which strangers would be arrested for minor infractions, held overnight in Blackwood's jail, and never seen again. The journal entry dated March 12, 1884, reads, "I have spoken with Mr. Winters at the boarding house. He confirms that at least 8 travelers have been arrested in the past month alone, mostly for public intoxication or disturbing the peace. None have been seen after their first night in custody." When questioned, Sheriff Blackwood merely states they were released and moved on. The town accepts this explanation without question, though their eyes betray their doubt. Mercer's investigation led him to the El Paso train station, where he attempted to verify Blackwood's claims that the missing individuals had departed by rail. The station master, Jacob Thornhill, initially refused to discuss the matter. It was only after several meetings, documented in Mercer's journal, that Thornhill confided his concerns. "Thornhill pulled me aside as I was leaving the station today," Mercer wrote on March 17th. "He spoke in whispers, though there was no one nearby to overhear. I've been station master here since before the railroad came through," he said. "I know every person who comes and goes by train. These men, Blackwood, claims to have put on eastbound or westbound trains. They never passed through my station. Not one." When I asked why he hadn't reported this discrepancy, Thornhill's face went pale. "My family lives here, Mr. Mercer, my children. Do you understand?" Before I could respond, he walked away, refusing to acknowledge me when I called after him. What made Sheriff Blackwood's reign of terror possible was not just his badge, but the atmosphere of fear he cultivated in El Paso. Standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broad as an ox yoke, Blackwood's physical presence alone was enough to silence most objections. His face, deeply scarred on the left side, reportedly from a knife fight in his younger days, rarely betrayed emotion. But it was his dogs that truly terrified the townspeople. According to multiple accounts collected by Professor James Hartfield of the University of Texas in his unpublished manuscript Frontier Justice and Injustice, dated in 1959, Blackwood kept a pack of 7 dogs, massive wolf-like creatures of indeterminate breed. He housed them in kennels behind the jail where their howls could be heard throughout the night. Blackwood was never seen without at least 2 of these animals at his side, and it was said that they obeyed his commands with unnerving precision. Martin Alvarez, who operated a small grocery near the jail, told Professor Hartfield that the dogs seemed to grow in number during Blackwood's tenure. "When he first came, there were 5, Alvarez recalled. "By Christmas, I counted 7. By February, there were at least 9. They grew larger, too, healthier. Their coats shone like they were being fed better than most people in town." The dogs were central to the horror that unfolded in El Paso, but the true nature of that horror remained hidden for decades. What we know now comes primarily from 3 sources: Thomas Mercer's journal, the partial confession of Deputy Warren Hayes, recorded in 1901, and the excavation conducted behind the old jail site in 1967. Deputy Hayes was not part of Blackwood's original team. According to county employment records, he was hired in November 1883, 2 months after Blackwood took office. Prior to his appointment, Hayes had worked as a butcher's assistant at Donovan's Meatpacking, located on the outskirts of town. This detail, seemingly insignificant at the time, would later take on grim significance in light of Hayes' confession. Hayes was described by those who knew him as a quiet, somewhat slow-witted young man who had previously shown no inclinations toward violence or cruelty. Professor Hartfield's interviews with El Paso residents who remembered Hayes suggested that he was, in many ways, the perfect accomplice for Blackwood, eager to please, easily intimidated, and skilled in the processing of meat. Mercer's initial curiosity about the disappearances might have remained just that, curiosity, had he not witnessed an arrest firsthand. On the evening of March 15, 1884, a cattle driver named Michael Collins arrived in El Paso after delivering a herd to the railhead. Collins, flush with payment and looking to celebrate, had too much to drink at the Red Lantern Saloon and became boisterous. According to Mercer's account, Sheriff Blackwood appeared almost immediately, as if he had been waiting for such an opportunity. The sheriff entered the saloon flanked by two of his hounds, Mercer wrote. The music stopped. Even the drunkest patrons fell silent. Collins, unaware of the danger, continued his loud storytelling until Blackwood placed a heavy hand on his shoulder. "You're disturbing the peace," the sheriff said, his voice betraying no emotion. Collins protested, of course, but went quietly enough when the dogs began to growl. As they left, I noticed Blackwood did not take the direct route to the jail. Instead, he led Collins toward the arroyo that runs behind the slaughterhouse. Something about the cattle driver's confused expression has stayed with me. It was the look of a man who does not yet realize he is already dead. Collins was never seen again. When Mercer inquired about the man the next day, Blackwood informed him that the cattle driver had paid his fine and caught the morning train east. The station master, when questioned privately, had no recollection of such a passenger. And yet no one in town would speak openly about the discrepancy. The Red Lantern Saloon became a focal point for Blackwood's predation. According to both Mercer's journal and later testimonies collected by Professor Hartfield, the establishment served as a convenient hunting ground. Travelers stopping for a drink after arriving by train or stage were particularly vulnerable, as they had few or no connections in town who might inquire after their disappearance. Eliza Montgomery, who worked as a barmaid at the Red Lantern during this period, provided one of the few first-hand accounts of Blackwood's selection process. In a letter to her sister in St. Louis, dated April 2, 1884, the letter surfaced during an estate sale in 1949. Montgomery wrote, "The sheriff comes in most nights, just stands by the door with those horrible dogs of his. He watches the customers, especially the ones who aren't local. I've seen him nod to himself like he's made a decision before approaching someone. Always the same approach, a minor charge, a night in jail to sleep it off, no need for alarm. The men always go quietly, the dogs make sure of that. I've started warning travelers who seem decent, telling them to move on to the next town. Some listen, most don't." What made Blackwood's terror so effective was the complicity he forced upon the townspeople. According to Hayes' confession, recorded in a letter to the El Paso Times shortly before his death in 1901, but never published, the original letter was found in the newspaper's archives during a cataloging project in 1965. The sheriff ensured that key members of the community were implicated in his crimes. Blackwood would invite the mayor, the judge, and other prominent men to private dinners at the jail, Hayes wrote. These dinners were lavish affairs with meat dishes of a quality unavailable elsewhere in town. It was only later, after I had assisted in disposing of the remains, that I realized the true source of the meat. By partaking in those meals, unwittingly or not, these men became bound to Blackwood's silence. These dinners, according to Hayes, became a monthly occurrence, always scheduled during the new moon, when the night was at its darkest. The guest list typically included Mayor Wilson, Judge Thornton, Bank President Hiram Colston, and occasionally the editor of the El Paso Herald, William Barrett. Hayes's confession suggests that while these men may have initially been unaware of the true nature of the meat they were consuming, at some point the truth became impossible to ignore. After the February dinner, Hayes wrote, I overheard the mayor speaking with Blackwood in hushed tones. "This has gone too far, Nathaniel," he said. "People are starting to talk." Blackwood's response chilled me to the bone. "Let them talk," he said. "They're all part of it now. Every last one of them has tasted what I've provided. They're no better than my dogs." The mayor had no response to that. He left with his head bowed, like a man who knows he's damned. The exact number of Blackwood's victims may never be known. Deputy Hayes, in his confession, estimated that at least 32 individuals disappeared during Blackwood's tenure as sheriff. Most were drifters, cowboys, or travelers, people passing through El Paso who would not be missed. Occasionally, however, Blackwood's attention would turn to local residents who had somehow earned his displeasure. The case of Emily Winters, the 19-year-old daughter of the boarding house owner, illustrates the personal nature some of these disappearances took. According to both Mercer's journal and Hayes's confession, Emily had rejected Blackwood's advances on multiple occasions. In early April 1884, she was arrested on charges of theft, specifically for allegedly stealing a silver brooch from the mercantile. Despite her father's protests and alibis from multiple witnesses, Emily was taken to the jail. "Mr. Winters came to me today, frantic with worry," Mercer wrote on April 7th. "His daughter has not been seen since her arrest 2 days ago. Blackwood claims she confessed to the theft and was sent to the Women's Reformatory in Santa Fe. I offered to telegraph the reformatory to confirm her arrival, but Winters shook his head. 'Better to let it be,' he whispered, though his eyes told a different story." Hayes's confession contains a particularly disturbing passage regarding Emily Winters. The girl was different. Blackwood kept her in the special cell for 3 days. He didn't allow me to bring her food or water. On the 3rd night, he ordered me to leave the jail entirely and not return until morning. When I came back, the cell was empty, but clean, too clean. The dogs were quieter than usual that day, almost mournful. Blackwood himself seemed changed after that, more reckless, as if he'd crossed some line that even he had previously respected. What became of Emily Winters was not definitively known until the excavation of 1967. During the construction of a new county administration building on the site of the old jail, workers uncovered a mass grave containing the partial remains of at least 27 individuals. Among the remains were a silver locket containing a photograph of the Winters family and a strand of long brown hair matching Emily's description. The Winters case marked a turning point in Blackwood's behavior, according to multiple sources. After Emily's disappearance, the sheriff became less cautious in his selection of victims. Local residents, not just travelers, began to vanish with increasing frequency. The El Paso Herald, which had previously ignored the disappearances, published a cautiously worded editorial on April 15, 1884, suggesting that concerned citizens have noted an unusual number of unexplained absences from our community in recent weeks and calling for greater transparency in matters of law enforcement. The physical evidence uncovered during the excavation provided the most damning testimony against Blackwood and confirmed the darkest rumors about his methods. According to the archaeological report filed by Dr. Robert Chambers of the University of New Mexico and subsequently classified until 1969, the remains showed clear evidence of processing consistent with butchery practices of the period. Long bones had been split to extract marrow. Skulls and smaller bones showed evidence of canine tooth marks. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the excavation was the discovery of a set of ledgers preserved in a metal box buried beneath the kennel floor. These ledgers, water-damaged but partially legible, contained what appeared to be Blackwood's own records, not of arrests or legal proceedings, but of his victims' yields. Each entry included a name, weight, and notations about quality and suitability for various purposes. Dr. Chambers' report included a particularly chilling excerpt from one such ledger entry. Collins M182 LBS, quality, excellent, notable marbling in flank and shoulder, yield 97 lbs. Prime, remainder to pack. Note, excessive alcohol consumption did not affect quality as anticipated. Consider implications for future selections. The full horror of Sheriff Blackwood's operation began to take shape through these combined sources. According to Hayes's confession, Blackwood had developed a system for disposing of those he arrested. Prisoners would be held in the jail's basement, a space unknown to most townspeople. At night, typically between midnight and dawn, Blackwood would select a prisoner, who would then be brought to what Hayes referred to as the processing room at the back of the property. The sheriff took particular pleasure in this part, Hayes wrote. He would explain to the prisoner exactly what was about to happen to them, how their disappearance had already been accounted for, and how no one would ever come looking for them. Some begged, some tried to fight. It made no difference. The dogs would be brought in to witness the processing, which I believe Blackwood saw as a form of training. Nothing was wasted. The remains deemed unsuitable for consumption were buried in the arroyo or fed directly to the pack. Hayes' confession suggests that Blackwood viewed his activities not merely as a means of disposing of prisoners, but as part of a larger philosophy. He would sometimes speak at length while working, Hayes wrote, about how the strong had always fed on the weak, how it was the natural order of things. He claimed that what made him different, superior in his mind, was his honesty about it. The whole world is built on predation, he told me once. I just refuse to dress it up with fancy words and false morality. The basement of the jail, where prisoners awaited their fate, was described in detail in Hayes' confession. It consisted of 3 cells smaller than those on the main floor, with no windows and only a single oil lamp for illumination. The cells had no proper beds, only straw pallets on the dirt floor. A narrow staircase connected the basement to the main jail, and the entrance to this staircase was concealed behind a heavy cabinet in Blackwood's office. The prisoners would sometimes call out from below, Hayes wrote. Blackwood would sit at his desk, listening to their pleas with something like satisfaction. He claimed he could tell a man's character by the way he behaved when hope was gone. The ones who prayed, he said, were the sweetest meat. The ones who cursed and threatened were tough and bitter. He preferred the former. Thomas Mercer's growing suspicions about the sheriff eventually led him to attempt an investigation of the jail at night. His journal entry from April 10, 1884 would be his last. I have arranged with the telegraph operator to send a message to my editor in Chicago should I fail to check in by noon tomorrow. Tonight, I plan to observe the jail from the abandoned Wright property across the arroyo. Hayes let slip that new prisoners are never processed during daylight hours. If my suspicions are correct, Blackwood's activities tonight should provide the evidence I need. The Wright property, a dilapidated farmhouse abandoned after a smallpox outbreak the previous year, offered a clear view of the rear of the jail and the kennels. According to Hayes's confession, Blackwood was aware of Mercer's plans. The sheriff had eyes and ears throughout the town, Hayes wrote. The telegraph operator was one of his informants. When Mercer arranged to send that message, Blackwood knew immediately. He laughed and said the journalist had just sealed his own fate. Mercer was never heard from again. According to Burlington Public Records, his family received a telegram from El Paso stating that he had contracted typhoid fever and died suddenly. His body was reportedly cremated due to the infectious nature of his illness. The telegram was signed by Sheriff Nathaniel Blackwood. Hayes's confession contains a brief but disturbing account of Mercer's actual fate. Blackwood caught him watching from the right place. Had the dogs with him. They didn't bark, just surrounded the man silently. I never saw the journalist again, but that night Blackwood worked alone in the processing room. The next morning he called the mayor and judge to a special breakfast. Said it was to celebrate the departure of that nosy Easterner. I couldn't bring myself to eat. What ultimately ended Blackwood's reign was not the discovery of his crimes, but a shift in the political landscape of El Paso. In late April 1884, U.S., Marshal Frank Kane arrived in town with a detachment of deputies. Their stated purpose was to investigate reports of smuggling operations along the Mexican border. The true reason for their presence, according to correspondence between Marshal Kane and the governor of Texas, discovered during research for a 1960 Texas Historical Society publication, was mounting pressure from railroad interests who had received troubling reports about travelers disappearing in El Paso. The Southern Pacific Railroad, which had invested heavily in developing El Paso as a major transportation hub, was concerned about the potential impact on passenger traffic. According to an internal memo from the railroad's San Francisco office, dated April 3, 1884, reports of suspicious disappearances in El Paso continue to accumulate. While local authorities appear unwilling or unable to address these concerns, the potential impact on our passenger business cannot be ignored. Travelers are beginning to avoid the El Paso route out of fear. This situation requires immediate intervention. The railroad's influence with the governor's office was substantial, and within weeks of receiving their concerns, Marshal Kane and his men were dispatched to El Paso. Their arrival on April 25, 1884, was noted briefly in the El Paso Herald, which described it as a routine inspection of border enforcement practices. The confrontation between Blackwood and Kane occurred on April 27, 1884. According to the El Paso Herald's brief report, Blackwood resisted federal authority and was killed in the ensuing gunfight, along with 2 of his deputies. Hayes, who survived by surrendering immediately, made no mention of the incident in his 1901 confession, suggesting that his letter was either incomplete or parts were removed before it was archived. What the newspaper failed to report, but was later revealed through Marshal Kane's official report to his superiors in Washington, declassified in 1955, was the condition of the jail when the federal officers took control. Kane described a slaughterhouse operation in the rear building, complete with implements for the processing of human remains. The basement cells contained 5 living prisoners, all in severely malnourished condition, who reported being fed only enough to keep them alive while they awaited processing. Marshal Kane's report includes testimony from one of these survivors, a cattle driver named Joseph Rathbone, who had been arrested for public intoxication 10 days prior. Rathbone states that during his confinement, he witnessed 3 other prisoners being removed from the cells at night. None returned. According to his testimony, Sheriff Blackwood would inform each prisoner that they were being released, only to lead them to the rear building. Rathbone reports hearing screams on each occasion, followed by sounds he described as like butchering day back home. He also noted that following these events, the dogs housed in the nearby kennels would become highly agitated. Perhaps most disturbing was Kane's description of the kennel area. The animals, 7 in number, displayed behavior inconsistent with typical canines. Upon our entry to the property, rather than barking or showing aggression, the creatures watched with an unsettling intelligence. When we approached the kennel, they retreated to the rear of their enclosure in unison, as if performing a rehearsed maneuver. The deputy assigned to feed them refused to enter the kennel alone, claiming the animals possessed an unnatural awareness. After witnessing their behavior myself, I ordered the animals destroyed. The execution of the dogs proved more difficult than anticipated, according to Kane's report. The first attempt, using standard firearms, was only partially successful. 3 of the animals died immediately, but the remaining 4 exhibited what Kane described as remarkable resilience, requiring multiple shots to subdue. Even more disturbing, Kane reported that the animals made no sound during the process, neither growling nor whimpering, but maintained eye contact with their executioners until the moment of death. The aftermath of Blackwood's death brought little closure to El Paso. The federal investigation was quietly concluded, its findings sealed by order of the governor. The surviving prisoners were released after signing confidentiality agreements. Deputy Hayes was permitted to leave town without charges, though he reportedly lived the remainder of his life in seclusion in New Mexico territory. Most telling was the town's reaction. According to personal letters collected from various El Paso residents of the period, compiled in the El Paso Historical Society's private archives in 1962, there was a collective decision to suppress all memory of Blackwood's crimes. The jail was demolished within a month of the incident. The property remained vacant until 1901. No official memorial was ever established for the victims. Their names, aside from those recorded in Mercer's journal and Blackwood's grotesque ledgers, have been largely lost to history. Margaret Wilson, the mayor's wife, wrote to her sister in Boston on May 12, 1884. Jeremiah has not been himself since the incident with the sheriff. He barely eats, and when he does, he often becomes ill afterward. He wakes in the night crying out about what we've done. I have suggested we leave El Paso, start fresh elsewhere, but he insists that running away would only confirm his guilt. What guilt, I cannot say, for he refuses to speak of the matter directly. Professor Hartfield's manuscript offers perhaps the most insight into the psychological impact of Blackwood's terror on El Paso. What made the town's complicity possible was not just fear of the sheriff, but fear of their own involvement. Every resident who remained silent about a disappearance, every official who accepted Blackwood's explanations, every diner who may have unknowingly consumed human flesh at one of his community meals, all became participants in the horror. The collective shame that followed made forgetting a necessity for the town's survival. This collective amnesia might have been permanent had it not been for Dr. Eleanor Blackwood's research in 1958. A historian with no known relation to the sheriff, Dr. Blackwood was investigating frontier law enforcement practices when she uncovered references to the El Paso incident in Marshall Kane's correspondence. Her subsequent investigation, despite resistance from local officials, eventually led to the 1967 excavation. Dr. Blackwood's research notebooks, portions of which were published posthumously in the Journal of Western Legal History in 1972, detail the obstacles she encountered in El Paso. Despite the passage of 75 years, there remains a palpable resistance to any inquiry into the events of 1884. Archives that should be open to scholarly research are mysteriously misplaced. Elderly residents who initially agree to interviews cancel at the last moment, often after being visited by younger family members. The name Blackwood elicits a response unlike any I have encountered in my career. Not anger or grief, but a deep, almost primal fear, as if speaking of him might somehow resurrect the man and his practices. What remains unclear even after all these years and investigations is how Nathaniel Blackwood came to develop his particular depravities. Records from before his arrival in El Paso are sparse. According to military records uncovered by Dr. Blackwood, a Nathaniel Blackwood served in the Union Army during the Civil War, attached to a unit that saw action at the Siege of Vicksburg. That same unit was later implicated in atrocities against civilian populations in Mississippi, though formal charges were never filed. A diary attributed to a Confederate physician, Dr. Samuel Whitmore, discovered in a private collection in 1954, contains a disturbing entry dated July 1863. Today we recovered the bodies of 3 local men who had been accused of providing intelligence to our forces. The manner of their death suggests a level of depravity I have not previously encountered, even in this brutal conflict. The bodies had been systematically butchered, with portions removed in a manner suggesting knowledge of anatomy. The Union officer overseeing this area is a Lieutenant Blackwood, who reportedly keeps a pack of half-wild dogs that he has trained for tracking. Several witnesses have claimed these animals were present at the executions. A letter discovered among Judge Michael Thornton's personal effects after his death in 1892, the letter is now held in the University of Texas archives, suggests that Blackwood may have had a history of similar behavior before arriving in El Paso. Written by a colleague in Tombstone, the letter warned, "The man you have appointed as sheriff is the same who was dismissed from service here under suspicion of feeding prisoners to his dogs." While no formal charges were proven, 3 witnesses came forward before suddenly recanting their testimonies and leaving town. I urge you to reconsider this appointment before El Paso suffers the same fate as the unfortunates who crossed his path here. If Judge Thornton heeded this warning, no record of his response exists. What is known is that he was among the regular attendees of Blackwood's private dinners at the jail. Between his time in Tombstone and his appointment in El Paso, Blackwood's whereabouts are less certain. According to research conducted by Professor Hartfield, there are scattered reports of a man matching Blackwood's description: tall, scarred face, accompanied by unusually large dogs, in several small settlements across the New Mexico Territory. In each location, local records show an increase in missing persons reports during the period of his residence, followed by his abrupt departure. In the mining town of Silver City, local newspaper archives from 1882 contain a brief item about a transient named Blackwood, who has taken up residence in the abandoned Reynolds property outside town, causing concern among neighboring ranchers due to his unusual collection of canines and the disappearance of several head of cattle in the vicinity. The item concludes by noting that Mr. Blackwood departed our community suddenly following an unexplained fire at his residence. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire case is the question of the dogs themselves. Marshal Kane's report described them as unlike any canines he had encountered before. Hayes, in his confession, wrote that Blackwood claimed to have raised them from pups on a special diet, and that they understood more than any animal should. The remains of the dogs were supposedly buried in a mass grave outside town, but when Dr. Eleanor Blackwood attempted to locate this site in 1959, no trace could be found. Hayes's confession contains a passage that suggests Blackwood viewed his relationship with the dogs as something beyond that of master and animals. He spoke to them as equals. Sometimes, late at night, I would hear him in the kennels, speaking in low tones, not like a man talking to dogs, but like one engaged in conversation. More disturbing still were the times I could swear I heard someone responding, a voice that was not quite human, not quite animal. When I asked him about it once, he smiled and said, "They're evolving, Hayes. With every feeding, they become something more than they were, something better." Rumors persisted for decades in El Paso about wild dogs roaming the arroyos outside town, dogs that would watch travelers from a distance but never approach. As late as 1942, a cattle rancher named Joseph Miller reported losing stock to wolf-like creatures that move together like they're thinking the same thoughts. His description of the pack leader, big as a calf with eyes that knew things, bears an unsettling resemblance to the description of Blackwood's favorite hound. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood's research led her to interview Miller in 1958, shortly before his death. According to her notes, the elderly rancher insisted that the animals he had encountered were not natural wolves or feral dogs. Miller became agitated when I suggested the creatures might simply be a wolf pack. "Wolves don't watch you like they're reading your thoughts," he said. "Wolves don't stand up straight on their hind legs when they think you're not looking." When I pressed for a clarification, Miller refused to elaborate, saying only, "Some things shouldn't be spoken about, especially as the sun's getting low." Other accounts from the region include a report filed by a U.S. Forest Service ranger in 1937 describing an encounter with what he initially believed to be a group of feral dogs in the Franklin Mountains north of El Paso. The ranger, Robert Pearson, wrote that the animals displayed behavior inconsistent with wild canines, including what appeared to be coordinated movements, suggesting a level of communication beyond normal pack behavior. Pearson also noted that when he fired a warning shot, the animals did not flee in panic as would be expected, but rather retreated in an orderly fashion, maintaining visual contact until they were beyond the ridge. The final chapter of Sheriff Blackwood's legacy came in 1969, when the classified files related to the case were scheduled to be opened to the public. 3 days before the scheduled release, a fire broke out in the archives section of the El Paso County Administration building. The fire, determined to be of unknown origin by investigators, destroyed all remaining physical evidence related to the case, including Blackwood's ledgers, Hayes's original confession, and the archaeological findings from the 1967 excavation. The timing of the fire raised immediate suspicions. Dr. Theodore Reynolds, who had been assisting Dr. Eleanor Blackwood in her research, told the El Paso Times, "This fire conveniently eliminates the most damning evidence just before it would have become public record. One has to wonder whether some descendants of El Paso's founding families might prefer that certain aspects of the town's history remain buried." Reynolds' comments were not included in the published article. According to former Times reporter Maria Sandoval, who provided this information to Professor Hartfield in 1963. The editor killed that quote, Sandoval recalled. He said it was irresponsible speculation that could damage the reputations of prominent citizens. When I argued that it was relevant to the story, he reminded me that the newspaper's owners were descendants of one of the families implicated in the Blackwood affair. Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, who had devoted over a decade to researching the case, died in a car accident while driving to El Paso to review the files before their public release. Her research notes, which she had reportedly kept in a briefcase that was always with her, were never recovered from the accident scene. The official investigation ruled Dr. Blackwood's death an accident caused by brake failure on a dangerous mountain road. However, her colleague, Dr. Reynolds, expressed doubts about this conclusion. In a letter to Professor Hartfield dated September 1969, Reynolds wrote, "Eleanor was meticulous about vehicle maintenance, having her car serviced before every research trip. More significantly, she had uncovered evidence suggesting that descendants of several original families involved in the Blackwood incident continued to protect their ancestors' reputations through a kind of informal conspiracy of silence." She mentioned receiving anonymous threats in the weeks before her death, which she had reported to the university security office. No record of these reported threats was ever found in the university's security files. When Professor Hartfield attempted to follow up on Reynolds's claims, he discovered that Dr. Reynolds himself had abruptly resigned his position and relocated to Canada, leaving no forwarding address. Today, little physical evidence remains of Nathaniel Blackwood's time in El Paso. The site of the old jail is now occupied by a parking structure. No plaques or markers indicate what occurred there. The descendants of those who lived in El Paso during that period rarely speak of it. When pressed, most claim that the stories are exaggerated or fabricated entirely. Yet, the legacy persists in subtle ways. El Paso County records show that the rate of pet ownership, particularly dogs, remained significantly lower than the national average until the 1970s. Local ordinances restricting the ownership of canines exceeding 50 pounds in weight remained on the books until 1987, and longtime residents still avoid the area where the jail once stood, especially after dark. Carlos Mendoza, whose family has operated a restaurant in downtown El Paso since the 1920s, shared a perspective common among older residents when interviewed by a local historian in 1988. "My grandfather would never speak of that time directly, but he warned all of us children to stay away from the old jail site. He said the ground there was malo, bad, poisoned. When developers built the parking garage in the 70s, my grandfather refused to attend the opening ceremony, even though the mayor personally invited him. He said some places should be left alone, buried under concrete and forgotten." The reluctance to discuss Blackwood's crimes extends beyond mere superstition. According to Professor Hartfield's notes, several prominent El Paso families can trace their wealth and standing directly to the period immediately following Blackwood's death. The redistribution of property and influence that occurred in El Paso during the summer of 1884 suggests a deliberate effort to reward those who maintained the conspiracy of silence, Hartfield wrote. Certain individuals who had been of modest means before the incident suddenly acquired substantial property holdings. Others, who might have been expected to inherit or assume positions of influence, disappeared from public life entirely. This theory is supported by an entry in Thomas Mercer's journal from late March 1884, in which he noted, "I've observed an unusual pattern in Blackwood's arrests. He seems to target not just the vulnerable and transient, but also those who pose some form of competition or obstacle to certain business interests in town." The owner of the new dry goods store, who was undercutting Harrison's prices, was arrested last week for alleged license violations. He has not returned to his shop. Harrison, meanwhile, has expanded his inventory to include goods identical to those previously sold exclusively by his competitor. Perhaps most telling is a tradition that persisted among El Paso law enforcement well into the 1950s. New officers were quietly advised never to bring prisoners into the station between midnight and dawn. No explanation was offered for this practice. It was simply understood as the way things are done here. Former El Paso Police Chief Gabriel Dominguez, who served from 1948 to 1957, addressed this unwritten rule in a rare interview granted to Professor Hartfield in 1960. When I first joined the force in '32, my training officer took me aside and told me never to process arrests between midnight and sunrise. When I asked why, he said, "That's Blackwood's time." I didn't understand the reference then, but no one questioned the rule. Years later, when I became chief and tried to eliminate this superstitious practice, I faced remarkable resistance, even from officers too young to have heard of Blackwood. Some things become part of an institution's DNA. The persistent rumors about Blackwood's dogs continued well into the 20th century. In 1951, a geological survey team working in the Franklin Mountains reported an encounter with what they described as unusually large canines that displayed behavior inconsistent with wild dogs or wolves. The team's report noted that the animals observed us from a distance, moving in coordinated patterns that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. When one of the survey team attempted to photograph the creatures, they retreated behind a ridge and could not be located, despite an extensive search. More disturbing are the accounts of Victor Ramirez, a rancher whose property bordered the arroyo where Blackwood allegedly disposed of remains. In a statement given to Dr. Eleanor Blackwood in 1957, Ramirez claimed that his family had experienced visitations for generations. They come on moonless nights, circling the house but never approaching directly. My grandfather called them Los Perros del Diablo, the devil's dogs. They don't bark or howl. The only sound they make is a sort of whisper, almost like speech, but not quite human. My father set traps, but they were always found sprung with no creature caught. When I was a boy, my cousin claimed he shot one, but when we went to find the body the next morning, there was only a trail of blood that led back to the arroyo and disappeared. In his final assessment of the case, written shortly before the archive fire destroyed much of his source material, Professor Hartfield wrote, "What makes the Blackwood case unique in the annals of American crime is not just the depravity of the acts committed, but the community's response to them. El Paso did not just experience terror, it digested it, incorporated it, and was fundamentally changed by it. The town became complicit, not merely through silence, but through consumption, both literal and figurative. Blackwood's true legacy was not the lives he took, but the collective guilt he force-fed to an entire community, a guilt that continues to be passed down, unspoken but undiminished, from one generation to the next. This guilt manifested in curious ways throughout El Paso's subsequent history. City records show an unusually high rate of charitable donations and religious participation among the families of those most closely associated with Blackwood. The Wilson, Thornton, and Colston families, whose patriarchs had been regular attendees of Blackwood's dinners, established substantial trusts for orphanages and hospitals in the early 1900s. Judge Thornton's grandson, Michael Thornton II, became known for his passionate advocacy of prison reform, funding improvements to jail conditions throughout Texas. In a speech delivered at the opening of a new rehabilitation-focused correctional facility in 1922, the younger Thornton made what some historians consider a veiled reference to his grandfather's complicity. "Our duty to those in custody is sacred, precisely because of the terrible power imbalance that exists between jailer and prisoner. History has shown us the darkest possibilities of what can occur when that power is abused, and when communities turn a blind eye to such abuse." Thomas Mercer's final journal entry, written hours before his disappearance, perhaps best captures the essence of the horror that gripped El Paso in 1884. "What disturbs me most is not the possibility that Blackwood is feeding his prisoners to his dogs, or worse, to the townspeople. It is the resignation I see in the eyes of those who suspect the truth. They have accepted this abomination as the price of peace in their community. They have learned to live with monsters, both the four-legged kind and the two-legged kind who wears a badge. And in that acceptance, they have themselves become something less than human." The journal was returned to Mercer's family in Vermont, along with his personal effects following his reported death from typhoid. However, according to family correspondence discovered by Dr. Eleanor Blackwood, Mercer's sister Harriet was suspicious of the circumstances surrounding her brother's death and the condition of his returned possessions. In a letter to her cousin, dated June 1884, Harriet wrote, "Thomas's journal arrived with the pages from April 10th, forward torn out. The final entry ends mid-sentence. When I inquired about this to the El Paso authorities, I was told that the missing pages had been damaged by the patient's fever, yet the preceding pages show no such damage." More troubling still was the state of Thomas's pocket watch, which was returned badly dented, with the time frozen at 2:17. Thomas was meticulously careful with that watch, a gift from our father. I cannot help but wonder what truly befell my brother in that desert town. Harriet Mercer's suspicions led her to contact a private detective agency in Denver, seeking to investigate her brother's death. However, according to family records, she abandoned this pursuit after receiving what she described as a most disturbing package from El Paso, the contents of which she never revealed. She never spoke of her brother's death again, and in her will she requested that his journal be sealed and not opened until 50 years after her death, which occurred in 1903. In 1964, during the renovation of an old boarding house on San Antonio Street, workers discovered a metal box hidden within a wall cavity. The box contained a single item, a tarnished sheriff's badge bearing the name Enile Blackwood. According to the contractor's report, one of the workers took the badge home as a souvenir. 3 weeks later, that same worker reported that his family dog, previously described as gentle as a lamb, had attacked and severely injured his young son. The dog was destroyed, and the badge was reportedly thrown into the Rio Grande. This incident might have been dismissed as coincidence had it not been followed by similar occurrences. In 1966, a doctoral student researching frontier law enforcement purchased several items at an estate sale, including a tarnished metal whistle that was reportedly used by Sheriff Blackwood to command his dogs. Within a month, the student's neighbors reported unusual behavior in local pets, dogs gathering silently outside the student's apartment at night, seemingly watching the building. The student eventually abandoned his research and left the university after reporting a home invasion in which nothing was taken, but his notes on the Blackwood case were destroyed and the whistle was missing. Perhaps the most troubling legacy of the Blackwood affair is its impact on subsequent generations of those involved. A statistical analysis conducted by sociologist Dr. Maria Garza in 1979 found that descendants of families directly implicated in the case showed significantly higher rates of certain psychological disorders, particularly those related to food aversion, paranoia, and night terrors. Her paper, Transgenerational Trauma in Border Communities, suggests that the psychological impact of participating in or witnessing extreme taboo violations, particularly those involving cannibalism, may be transmitted through generations through both social learning and possibly epigenetic mechanisms. While Garza's research was controversial and never published in a peer-reviewed journal, anecdotal evidence supports her observations. Eleanor Martinez, whose great-grandfather served on the El Paso police force during Blackwood's tenure, told a local historian in 1985, "My family has always had strange rules about food. My grandfather would not eat meat unless he had personally witnessed the animal being slaughtered and processed. My father refused to eat at restaurants his entire life. I grew up thinking this was normal, just an old Mexican tradition, until I learned about our family's connection to that time." The most recent chapter in the Blackwood saga occurred in 2001, when construction workers expanding the parking facility that stands on the former jail site uncovered a sealed chamber that had somehow been missed during the 1967 excavation. According to the initial report filed by the construction foreman, the chamber contained animal remains and what appeared to be written materials. However, before archaeologists could properly examine the site, a water main ruptured, flooding the excavation. By the time the water was pumped out, the chamber had collapsed, and any contents were irretrievably damaged. Dr. James Thornton, a descendant of Judge Michael Thornton and professor of Southwestern history at the University of Texas at El Paso, has spent much of his career attempting to separate fact from fiction in the Blackwood case. In his 1997 book, The Hunger of Justice: El Paso's Darkest Chapter, Thornton writes, "What makes the Blackwood case so persistently disturbing is not merely the atrocities committed, but the way they implicate an entire community. This was not the work of a lone madman operating in secret, but a system of predation that required and received the complicity of ostensibly respectable citizens. In a very real sense, El Paso did not just harbor a monster, it fed him, enabled him, and in the process internalized something of his monstrosity." Thornton's book represents one of the few attempts by a descendant of those involved to directly confront the legacy of Blackwood's crimes. Most families connected to the case continue to avoid the subject entirely. When approached for interviews for this narrative, several descendants of prominent El Paso families from the 1880s declined to comment, with one stating bluntly, "That's not a door anyone should be opening, even after all this time." Whether one believes the accounts of Nathaniel Blackwood's crimes or dismisses them as frontier mythology, one fact remains undisputed. For a period of 8 months in 1884, the citizens of El Paso lived in the shadow of a predator who wore a badge. Their silence, whether born of fear, complicity, or shame, allowed that predator to feed, literally and figuratively, on the vulnerable. And in the desert outside El Paso, where the wind carries the dust of unmarked graves, some say you can still hear, on the darkest nights, the distant howling of dogs that sound almost, but not quite, like wolves. A final haunting detail emerged in 1965 when an elderly woman named Sarah Coleman contacted Professor Hartfield after reading a newspaper article about his research. Coleman, who was 9 years old in 1884, had lived near the El Paso jail. In a recorded interview, she recalled, "The thing I remember most was how the sheriff's dogs would watch me when I walked past. Not like normal dogs that bark or wag their tails. They would just stand still and follow me with their eyes. My father forbade me from walking near the jail alone. He said those weren't really dogs at all, but something the sheriff had made. I didn't understand what he meant then. I'm not sure I want to understand it now." When asked what she thought had happened to the dogs after Blackwood's death, Coleman's response was chilling in its simplicity. "Dogs die. What the sheriff made doesn't."